Hello, everyone, and welcome back to CLI's Legalpreneurs Spotlight Future 50 series. In this series, we're showcasing thought leaders and doers in legal innovation, legal tech, and AI all around the world. I'm joined today by CLI fellow Dr. Mitchell Adams. Mitchell was our first fellow in emerging technologies with a focus on prompt engineering. Mitchell has contributed numerous blogs and led CLI legal Gen AI clinics during his fellowship, and that work has culminated in his legal prompt engineering guide. Yay! I can't wait to get into all of this with him. But I must also mention his other job. Mitchell is a senior lecturer at Swinburne Law School and heads up its legal technology and design clinics too. And if I may add, really leading the space in legal education in those areas as well. A huge welcome to you, Mitchell. It's wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here.
I wanted to kick off by chatting a little bit about your fellowship, and I'm wondering if you could just tell us, what initially sparked your interest in the area, and what have you kind of personally and professionally taken away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. This fellowship has been an absolute blast. Playing in an area that's always been one of my favorite areas to play in, professionally and academically, which is around emerging technologies and its impact on legal practice. So this fellowship in particular has been looking at and investigating generative AI tools with a focus on prompt design and prompt engineering. And I think my interest in it really came from observing in the wider sort of environment that AI was everywhere all of a sudden, really quickly. Everyone was talking about it. There was so much interest. I don't think that interest has died off since the release of ChatGPT in 2022. And so I started to get really interested about how these tools were being adopted in legal practice settings and even in other domains as well, not just law. And they were being adopted often without a proper understanding of how to use these tools effectively, and not a lot of guidance around, where to start, what was best practice, and giving exemplars about how to use these tools in legal practice. And I think, sort of on a personal note, I've been playing around with the tool since ChatGPT landed in 2022, and I started to notice differences in the way that I was interacting with the tool. So the outputs that I was getting from it were vastly different if I was doing a very basic prompt, as opposed to maybe a more structured prompt. So I was starting to see those differences, and I wanted to understand what was leading to those differences. But I think my personal takeaways from the fellowship is, developing a deeper understanding of how large language models work, or a lack of a better word, how they think. I know that sort of terminology can be controversial, and how to leverage their capabilities in day-to-day legal tasks. But in terms of professional growth, I think the thing that I've taken away from the fellowship has been the establishment of collaborative networks of others that are interested in either dipping their toes into using generative AI tools, or they're using them every day. And I think that's reflective of our profession as a whole. It's a very human centered profession. And I think even though we can think about these tools in isolation, I think having a group of people to talk about how to use these tools, what have they experienced, has been probably the best part of the professional growth out of the fellowship.
Yeah, it's a very collaborative community and very generous. And I think if having to cope with an avalanche, which it's kind of felt like, of information and new tech has brought us together on that basis, it's really been a big plus. So I agree with you absolutely. But during the course of your fellowship, I'm sure of the things that you discovered, something might have jumped out at you in terms of something that you weren't expecting, almost something that's counterintuitive in a way as well, or something that you were expecting. So I'm just wondering, how did that go? And particularly in terms of obviously how Gen AI and prompting is impacting legal research and legal practice for that matter as well.
I think it's a great question because I was not expecting after 18 months how quickly this technology changed.
Yeah.
And observing differences in these tools over that 18-month period. So the sort of counterintuitive discovery I found is that not all large language models are the same. I think as part of the fellowship, I was investigating mainly the commercial LLMs that are out there, like ChatGPT or Claude. And what I was doing was experimenting to see how prompts performed on one tool versus the other. And I think that was the one thing that I wasn't expecting was learning by, playing these tools off against one another, strangely enough. Some of them are good for some things, and another one can be good for another. So I had to learn to not just stick with one, strangely enough. I was sort of going into it thinking that I would just play around with one, but ended up probably to the detriment of my back pocket, having a couple too many licenses to some of them. But seeing how they all work, because they can have different graphical user interfaces, and that can impact how you may perceive the trustworthiness of the output, which was some really good, interesting research that came out probably 12 months ago. And seeing how they perform, and I think the biggest sort of learning curve was when the reasoning models came out. And that sort of changed how we thought about how these tools work, how we prompted them. And I wasn't expecting such a shift like that, probably 12 months in. And so I had to really rethink about what the guide that I created catered for the typical large language models that people can have access for free, as opposed to those models that you can have access to if you pay a subscription to. So being very cognizant of what users may already have access to or not have access to.
And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for me, that shift with the reasoner models has been that I guess we're genuinely seeing for the first time a real challenge to anybody whose profession relies on any degree of expertise. And I think we all thought really that was a much longer way away. And it's kind of here. It's
Right.
better and better, right?
Yeah, and I think I was very skeptical at the beginning. Very early on, saw a lot of hallucinations, not great answers, very American-centric sort of responses, especially in our domain. But 18 months in, the responses that I'm seeing are pretty slick. I'm not seeing a lot of the hallucinations that I saw in the past. They've come a long way in a very short period of time.
And is that through, for want of a better expression, switching on, I'm just going to call it the deep research. Obviously, it comes by different names and different tools, but by using or having access to that aspect in particular?
I think it's been a function of the interest and the demand for the tools. And I think that's given the imperative of those that train these models to keep training them, to keep making them better. So I think that incentive is there and it's going to continue. And so when we're looking at, the extra bells and whistles around things like deep research, there is this desire to have extra features that people do want. It's not just here's a chat interface, have a go at playing around with it. They are thinking about how can we push this user experience in a direction that users actually want it to be, and having that transparency around, looking for information or going outside of the training data. So they're being very responsive to customer sort of demand and needs of what they want from the tools.
And what's underscoring that, I guess, is a level of sophistication in the users of the tech as well, which is advancing probably more rapidly than we thought it might as well, which is kind of a segue into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is over that period of 18 months, and normally that would just be too short a period for me to ask the question I'm going to ask, but as you say, it's all moving so quickly. Have you seen kind of a discernible attitude change towards generative AI, but prompting in legal? And I guess I'm asking that, I'm going to ask it in two places. One, in terms of your contact with folks in practice, but also, I think really interestingly, your contact with students as well.
Yeah, it's 18 months is a very long time for, I think, for the technology and its
Seems
advanced.
to be.
Yeah, yeah. But I
Yeah.
think in terms of the attitudes towards the technology, I think if I sort of take a few steps back and I look at over that 18 months, I think the main change that I've seen is a greater curiosity in the use of the technology. But I still definitely see three distinct camps of individuals, whether it is professionals or students, that I saw very early on in the fellowship, which, there's the first sort of camp that doesn't engage because they don't have time to investigate the technology. Then there's the second camp that are ready to experiment, but they just don't know where to start, and they're looking for information about how to make that first step. And then the third camp are those that have been probably using it for a while. They may or may not be using it every day. So they may be experimenting and they're just hungry for more information and more use cases about how can use it. So I think I still see those three sort of distinct camps flying around, but I think the general sort of curiosity has been amping up over the 18 months. So I think that's what I've been seeing over the time period.
You're absolutely right. And it's like those three speeds in a way that are running in parallel where, one always has to be cognizant of that, I guess,
Mm.
which is also another great segue into the guide. So just tell us a bit about that. Like, how did you go about creating it? And also, what does it cover and why? How did you kind of choose what you're going to cover?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a great question after the one we've just covered because I was very cognizant of those different types of individuals who are coming to the technology, especially those that are curious about it but don't know where to start. And I think how I went about creating the guide, because I think it looks very different now to what I thought it was going to be, 18 months ago. And it was some real good old-fashioned experimentation and old-fashioned research. So testing across different types of platforms and offerings from different providers of large language models, and also doing some, literature searching in the computer science realm. So I was definitely learning what this is looking like in a very different domain, which was kind of refreshing as well. Their journal articles are very shorter compared to legal. So at a very high level, the guide is structured following a progression from basic concepts to advanced techniques and use cases, because I wanted to bring people along the journey, especially for those that aren't familiar with the technology yet but don't know where to start. But giving people that may already be familiar with the technology a place to start where they can go, I already know how an LLM works. I can just start dipping into how do I start prompting. So the guide is structured around five main parts. That's how I've sort of broken it up. And the first part is very much for those that know nothing about the technology. So it's answering that question, what is artificial intelligence? Because the term is being used quite in a lot of different ways in a lot of different circles. And I think those that are quite skeptical are starting to think that it's being used as a bit of a marketing term. But the first start is really much covering the concepts such as what is generative AI, what are large language models and how do they work, before looking at what type of large language models are currently available. And for those that have been playing in the space, looking at, what offerings does OpenAI have? What offerings does Anthropic have? And what are the differences between the different models? Because I definitely learned from a lot of different conversations with people is that when they log into these tools, they don't realize that there's different models that are available for them to use. So sort of demystifying what are the different models and how do they differentiate from one another. The next section then goes into what I call the fundamentals of prompting or prompt design. So what are the best practices when prompting these models? And when I talk about prompt design, what I'm talking about is the process of carefully crafting the phrasing, structure, and content of prompts to elicit high quality, relevant, and coherent responses from the model. Most of us would have seen little bits and pieces of this floating around on the internet, but sort of pulling it all together so those that come to the guide really know what are the best practices when you're first logging in and you're wanting to get good outputs from these models. For those that have probably already been playing around with the tools and already know how to structure their prompts, this is when they'll probably come into the guide, which is looking at the advanced techniques and prompt engineering. So when we're talking about prompt engineering, what we're looking at here is that technical and systematic approach that really utilizes principles researched and tested by computer scientists. So this is when I was dipping into their literature when they were testing these large language models. So covering the various different techniques that have come out since 2022 and how they can be used in the legal domain. So giving a lot of examples about this is what the technique is, but this is what it would look like in a prompt that would be relevant for a legal task. The next section is very much for those that are really wanting to experiment. So giving a lot of practical applications and use cases for legal tasks. So providing example prompt templates to experiment with. And so some of these are sort of my prompt templates and others that I've seen from other thought leaders in the space as well. But then importantly, in the sort of final part, I probably don't like that it's probably at the end of the guide, but it is really quite important, which is about evaluating your outputs and how to refine those outputs. So what are some of the tips and tricks around you may put a prompt in, you may or may not be happy with the output, but how do you evaluate that output? While also balancing that across the ethical and professional responsibility considerations that we need as legal professionals. So sort of rounding it off around, we may just prompt these models, but going into it with a frame of mind around iterative prompting. So not just being happy with the one output, but sort of challenging the responses from these models and using some particular techniques to sort of refine those outputs.
Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations on the guide. It's really very significantly going to contribute to the materials and the tools that are out there. Normally, I would say the literature, it does that too. But I think that as a guide, it provides that context. It's user-friendly. It's super practical. And for me, it becomes a tool in and of itself to be able to operate all the other tools effectively as well. So congrats, absolutely amazing. Really, 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 really good stuff. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but I don't want to let you go without asking you this question, because given the nature of your fellowship and the work that you've done and the guide, I think, it's an important one to end with and to get your thoughts on. What's your vision for how prompting skills will reshape legal practice in the next few years? And if it's too far, I'm happy to go with the next few months, given what we've said about pace. And I guess the other thing is, what advice would you give legal professionals who want to improve their prompting skills so that they increasingly become an integral part of the way that they work in their practices? And with the second part of that question, beyond, of course, accessing your guide. That's got to be the first one, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, because this has definitely been in the back of my mind, and this probably taps into my other role as a legal educator as well. I'm hoping that around prompting skills, this will be a pathway to improve digital literacies as a whole in legal practice and in law. And we're starting to make strides in this space, but I think this is going to be the one technology that will get us to all start talking about this at the one time and starting that conversation around what are those essential legal skills. They're either taught in law schools or they're taught in practice. And I think that conversation is starting now. And I think it's because this technology has come out that we feel brave enough to actually have this wider conversation. Because I love teaching digital literacies in law. It's always fun. You always get people having that aha moment, whether in the classroom or in practice. And it's such a joy as an educator to see that occur. And I think there's that, don't want to call it, but it's a little bit of magic that happens when people are playing around with this tool in particular. It's very different compared to, let's say, an automation tool. There's that magic that can happen in the room when someone's playing around with it for the first time. And I think it can be that pathway to talk about and improve digital literacies as a whole. The other thing that I hope happens as a larger community of legal practitioners is probably this starts the development of a legal specific sort of prompt library that's built around generative AI. So contributing as a community to around, this is what worked for me. It really worked really well. I want to share this with other people. I hope it starts that type of community conversation or that type of community of practice around this technology. And I think that'll be important also, given that a lot of different legal tech tools are either built on, large language models or generative AI capability, or a generative AI capability has been put onto a pre-existing legal tech tool. I think that'll be important, given that we'll be seeing this type of capability across a lot of different providers. So I think when it comes to the advice that I would give legal professionals or even law students as well, is probably start with an understanding of how large language models work, either conceptually or practically, because we need to know their strengths and their limitations. I think even though we felt a bit of pain around hallucinations, early on and even now, that was an important conversation to bring up what are the limitations of the technology, but more importantly, how the technology actually works. I thought that was really quite helpful for the wider community. If you're coming to this for the first time and you don't know where to start, have fun with it. I think don't come into it, wanting to do a legal task. Get it to write some poetry or get it to write a song in a particular style. See what it can do in an area of interest that may sit outside of law. I think that's a really good place for people to start, to just have fun with it. Most of the commercial providers will offer their models for free. So there's no obligation to buy a license. So feel free to have some fun with it. And I think after that, just practice. Have a look at how to craft a good prompt, look at some of the advanced techniques and just keep practicing and see what comes out of it and do that iterative refinement process that comes with prompting. But more importantly, join community of practices like that with the Centre for Legal Innovation. Terry, you've done such a great job bringing people together who are very optimistic and excited about this technology, that it's become such a great community of practice to share techniques and experiences, which I think is really important when we're looking at technology. It just doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think lawyers do their best work when they're talking with and working and collaborating with others. So join the Centre for Legal Innovation because you will definitely learn stuff from other people.
Oh, thanks, Mitchell. And do sign up too. It's free for Mitchell's clinic on Legal Gen AI, where he's leading every month or so a clinic that's really looking at experiments and use cases and encouraging sharing between individuals there as well. And that's been amazing, Mitchell. Thank you so much for that. I do just want to take a second to again congratulate you on your fellowship. Absolutely amazing. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And it's the one fellowship I wish could have gone on perhaps for the next 10 years, but I know that we will remain professional colleagues during that time as well. Thank you so much, Mitchell. And again, congrats on an exceptional fellowship.
Thank you so much, Terry.